previous video, we looked at the multi-resolution function within the Sculpt workspace. Now you may have noticed at the top here in the poly groups that I've renamed my objects, low poly body, low poly spines and low poly teeth, and I've also added them down here into my palette just to preserve the state of those models inside of the model room as they are at the moment. So the way that I did that was simply by dragging the layer down into this poly models palette. So it's just a way for me to preserve the model inside here, and I can always come back to this whenever I need to. Now I'm ready to move this object over into the Sculpt room to start the process. Now there's two things that I could do here. I could send this model as it is now, or I could subdivide this model again using my Catmull Clark and use that as my base model for sculpting on. It's really up to you in terms of what resolution you want to start your sculpting process at. If your model has too low a poly count and you're wanting to take it over into the Sculpt room, then you may find that when you bake all that high-res sculpt detail back to an object that's very low poly, you may find quite a few artifacts on those bakes. If that's the case, you'll want to increase the resolution within the modeling workspace and start at that slightly higher poly count, and that will reduce the amount of artifacts later in the process. So maybe you would want to use the Catmull Clark smoothing and start at this resolution as your base for sculpting. In this case, I've just called it Dino Low Poly Body CC, and then I've gone ahead and dragged this down into the palette down here, and this would be my starting object that I would take over into the Sculpt workspace. It really depends what poly count is required for your specific model. For this project, I'm going to use this resolution to start my sculpting. I've preserved a lower resolution version inside the palette, as we've already seen. So I'll come back to this in another video and show the differences between the two baked models. So with that established, let's take this object now over into the Sculpt workspace. So I'll click onto the Sculpt workspace and go to Geometry, and I'll go over to Retopo Mesh to Sculpt Mesh. Let's just turn off my Z-axis there, and we can see our model now. We can also see our sculpt tree, and this time we are starting at 19,000 polygons because we're starting at that higher resolution as discussed earlier. Next, I'll click on Add the lowest level from the Retopo room, which will start the multi-resolution function within this palette. So now I can start to add to the top layer and increase the resolution of my object. And you can see that I'm at a resolution of 2. And I'm going to start just on a fresh layer here and begin to block out some of the landmarks on my reference that we can see here. Now you can use at this stage any of the shaders that you have available to you. Any of these will work. It really depends on what shader you prefer to sculpt with. Also, it's a good idea to have your layers palette where you can access your layers easily, and it's also good practice to name your layers. So you can name this. It's a good idea to put, for example, sculpt layer, which basically means that this layer contains sculpt information, and then whatever this sculpt information is. So I could just say first pass. And then I can build this up by adding new layers, and then I can see the accumulative effect of those sculpt passes on my object. Another good option is to have your color palette open here with your reference image, and if you click on these three dots here, you can change this to an image and select the actual image that you want. And finally, in my setup here, I've got symmetry docked in my UI, and if I enable that, you can see that my symmetry is set to the Z axis here, and whenever I sculpt on one side, it's going to sculpt exactly onto the other side as well. And if I don't want to see this symmetry line, then I can just remove that, and it's still working as symmetry. It's just removed that extra information for me. And as I mentioned in the previous video, it's a good idea to keep your eye on this here, where we have our poly count, and this relates to our multi-resolution window down here, and that every time I increase the resolution, I'm going to see that number increase here. So it's a good idea just to keep referencing just how dense your mesh is getting every time you increase the subdivision level. So the last part of our setup here are the brushes, and I'm going to try to stick to the default brushes and mainly use these ones across here, but we'll also look at some alternatives when we get into more of the higher details later on in the process. It's always a difficult point in the project when you start a sculpt, because you don't really know where the best place to start, and in truth there is no best place to start, you just have to start. So with the reference here, I'm just going to start off with the easy parts of this image. So these strong lines around the eyes here, these are relatively easy parts to start with anyway, and we can just draw those landmarks in. Now the brushes within the surface mode on the left hand side here, I tend to use are Rapid Smooth and Mud. So all I'm going to do is just start to draw basically onto the surface and try to match these sort of features that we can see here. Now just a quick overview on the brush, where you can see this red line on the cursor, and if I hit Control on the keyboard it turns blue, and if I hit Shift on the keyboard then it will turn green, meaning that red will lift the surface like so, and blue will cut into the surface like so, and green will smooth the surface out, and I can smooth out any marks that I make on here. So with my layer selected, as you can see, I'm starting off and I'm just going to start to draw in some of these landmarks that I'm looking at here. Now all the time I'm going to be increasing and decreasing the size of the brush and just working my way around, and sometimes, like here for example, I'm only going to just make a small impression on there and then move on to the next part. Don't try to focus too much on any one part, just move around the mesh and add these pieces in where you can see and match that reference. So I'm not going to be talking all the way through here, and we'll speed up a little bit as we go, but generally where I hit more important areas, then I will try to explain the reasons why I'm doing what I'm doing. So here for example, I'm trying to make this jaw area here a little bit more pronounced, and straight away I will dig in to the back of that jaw there like so, and I'll just try to bring in a couple of these folds on the neck here and just start to block those in. Here we can see on the back of the neck that we've got this movement across the neck, so I'll try to just replicate that with some very quick strokes across the back. And what I like about these brushes here is that all I'm doing here is just removing the smoothness away from the actual mesh that we've got, and a lot of this detail is just coming from breaking this skin up, breaking this surface up. And I'm not really doing that much in terms of brushwork other than just tapping the surface with it and just breaking it up and making it a little bit more uneven. And it works really well to give that illusion of a loose skin on there. You can see that when I compare what I have here and what I have here, the two are very far apart in terms of detail, but there's just enough there for me to understand what I'm aiming for later on in the process. As I said at the beginning of this section, it's a difficult thing to start, and by keeping very loose all over, you're making it easy to start the next process. It's one step at a time. Again, underneath here, we don't have much reference underneath, so I'm just going to basically replicate what was on the top there by going across very loosely with it here. So let's move on and not dwell too long in any one place. Let's move over to this section here and just start to make some sort of muscle definition. Let's change our brush over to the mud brush. Again, this one just buckles the surface. Here we can see some deep lines within the shadows here underneath, so let's try to replicate that. I'm going to hold down Control rather on the keyboard and just dig right into those areas and then smooth it out. And each one of these little, here for example, this line here, each one of these little intersections between brush strokes are interesting details that I will work on further as I progress through this, and I'll try to just bring those out a little bit more just to give me some clues in the next pass of what I was thinking about on here. A little bit more folds over this part around here. I think this would have some folds, and this is the whole process, but very quick, very loose, and just making some areas of the surface to give you some ideas of surface detail and to give it a much more organic, thick skin feel to the geometry here, rather than having that very uniform flat geometry that we had from the modeling room. And that's the beauty of this pass that we're doing here, that we're able to remove the cleanliness of the model that we have in the modeling room. And over the back. Don't forget, we've got these spines that we'll add later on, so it's a more detailed pass than we are at now. And if our lighting, for example, is coming from this direction, if I hold Shift down and left click and hold, I can move the lighting around to view from this angle here as well. So maybe on this back leg here I can put a little bit more muscle into the back there, smooth that out again, just scrub along and just add that detail in. So let's move over here to the There's a little bit of detail there that I missed on the tail, so let's just follow that through. Again, let's move our light back around to this way. So this line here is going to continue down the length of the tail. So I'm going to hold Control down and just dig in on the tail, something like that, just to show that continuation of this recess in the skin here, and then just smooth that out. Let's put in a little bit of a tendon on the back of this here, smooth that down again just to imply, dig in either side of that tendon and smooth that out again. We've got the heel here, we can dig in. Let's move our light source around so we see what we're doing. So as you can see, I'm literally just scrubbing across the surface here just to give me some detail, but also just remove that perfection from the polygon modeling that we did. Okay, so that's looking okay. Let's just focus on this arm a little bit more. Sorry, on the hand here, have to get it in a little bit tighter. And just tap with the smooth and just break that surface up. Now I will need to change my brush over here. I'm going to use an inflate brush on here, and just to thicken up these fingers a little bit more with the subdivision Catmull Clark. It's just tended, because these are quite thin digits on the finger, and that extra level of subdivision has just pulled them in quite thin, so they are quite small now. We can work on the other side as well, and on the other side of the symmetry, and that's enough on that pass. Let's just return to the head over here and back to either the mud brush or the rapid smooth brush, and just move these around here. Let's bring back my reference on the head. Okay, so there we have the end finishing parts of our first pass. We can go over, or we can do little bits on the tongue as well, and maybe roughen this tongue a little bit, smooth it out. And this skin in here, I could possibly just hold down control and just push inwards a little bit more on this area. Just tap the surface around here. Even I could push in on the throat area. Just push that back a little bit further. Holding control if needed. So as you can see, the whole of the model there has been treated pretty much the same all the way over. I've not focused on any part and not dwelled too long on any part of that model at all, and I've tried to keep the same speed going all the way around, just so I'm not tempted to go in and start to really refine anything at this stage, because that's the last thing that I want to do, because it will slow the whole process down as I fix things that I was too eager to create too early in the stage. And it's just experience really, that once you've done that a few times, you start to learn where you tend to get excited about a project and maybe work a little bit harder on that part, and want to do too much detailing in a particular area when you need to be focusing more so on the whole thing at this stage of the sculpting pass here. So I'm not changing any resolution, I'm just adding some bumps and lumps where I think I'm going to be needing those later on. Probably a little bit more down the tail here. We have to be careful down here where we're getting very tight with the polys. And smooth out. Okay, so with that done, one of the things that we can do here, so just as an example, we have our first pass layer, and if I want to here, what I can do is I can reduce the amount of this whole sculpt that I've done using this depth layer here. So if I reduce the depth, you can see that it's going back to the original. It's reducing the opacity of all those brush strokes that I made. So if I've been overall adding too much detail to that, I can just reduce that down and leave this first pass layer at 46% or whatever percentage I feel necessary, which gives me enough detail at that first pass level. Probably a little bit more than that, maybe around about 60% should be okay. And if I'm happy with that, I can just lock that layer just so I don't change that from now on. So in the next video, we'll continue creating more passes on our geometry and building the surface of our sculpt. See you next time.